My name is Adrian Cole, and until that morning I believed in quiet loyalty, the kind that never makes headlines but keeps companies alive. I was 38, working out of a glass and steel office tower in downtown Seattle, senior systems coordinator in a firm that moved money, data, and obligations for other people who didn't want to understand how any of it actually worked. I arrived before most people, left after most lights were off, and in between I kept an invisible machine breathing. The hook didn't come with shouting or drama. It came with a calendar invite sent at 7:42 a.m., titled Quick Sync, 10 minutes. That alone told me something was wrong. No one schedules 10-minute meetings unless they want to say something unpleasant and escape before you can respond. When I walked into the conference room, the city was still wrapped in fog, ferries cutting slow lines through gray water below. At the table sat Martin Hale, the new director, immaculate suit, polished smile, and Laura from HR with her laptop already open, eyes carefully unfocused. Martin had been with us exactly 6 weeks, long enough to replace the old director's photos with his own leadership quotes, short enough to still ask people's names twice. He gestured for me to sit and started talking before my chair touched the floor.
He spoke about alignment, about temporary measures, about how the market required flexibility. Then he said the sentence that split my working life cleanly into before and after. My salary would be reduced by 20%. Effective immediately, just until things stabilized. He said it lightly, like a favor he expected me to understand. I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because my brain was buying time while my chest tightened. I asked one question, calm, precise, the way I always spoke in meetings. What metrics defined stabilization? Martin smiled wider and said that was still being evaluated. Laura typed without looking up. In that moment, I saw the shape of the betrayal clearly. It wasn't personal hatred, it was something colder. Martin needed to show savings fast. He'd scanned the org chart, found someone highly paid who didn't manage people directly, and decided I was safe to cut because I was quiet. I thought of the years I'd spent building the operational backbone no one wanted to own. The reconciliation scripts that caught payment errors before clients saw them, the undocumented integrations between legacy systems that couldn't talk but somehow did, the alert logic tuned so well that executives slept through the night. None of it was flashy, none of it had my name on it. As Martin talked, I felt a slow, heavy heat settle behind my eyes. Not explosive anger, but something denser, more dangerous. I realized they weren't asking, they were informing. They expected gratitude for being kept at all. When the meeting ended, Martin clapped his hands once and said, "Appreciate you being a team player, Adrian." I walked back to my desk in a haze, the office now filling with noise, keyboards and laughter, and the illusion of normalcy. My inbox was already blinking with minor issues, small fires that only I knew how to put out. I stared at the screen, and for the first time in years, I didn't fix them right away. Instead, I felt something in me shift. Loyalty had always been my default, my identity even, but now it felt naive, almost embarrassing. They had turned my dedication into leverage against me, had decided that because I cared about the system, I would accept being diminished for it. I opened a private document and started listing everything I touched that wasn't formally documented, everything that technically belonged to me because I'd built it on my own time, with my own tools, because no one else would. As I typed, the fog outside lifted, sunlight cutting sharp lines across the floor, and with it came clarity that chilled me with its certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a temporary inconvenience. It was a calculation, and I was expected to absorb the loss quietly. Sitting there, hands steady on the keyboard, I understood something fundamental and irreversible. If I stayed and swallowed this, it would happen again and again until there was nothing left to cut. The moment I accepted that, the desire to simply endure died. In its place rose something deliberate and inevitable. They had decided my value was optional. I decided, just as calmly, that they would learn exactly how wrong that assumption was. The days after the meeting passed with an unnatural slowness, as if time itself had decided to watch me instead of move me forward. And during those days, I learned how loud an office becomes when you stop cushioning it. I kept doing my job, at least on the surface, answering questions, closing tickets, nodding in meetings, but internally, everything had shifted into analysis mode. I wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. I was methodical, which frightened me more than rage would have. At night, lying awake beside my phone as notifications buzzed for systems no one else truly understood, doubt crept in. What if I was wrong? What if this really was temporary? I had a mortgage, a reputation, a career built on being reliable, not dramatic. Walking away would mean stepping into uncertainty, and uncertainty had always felt like irresponsibility to me. But then I would remember Martin's smile, the way Laura hadn't met my eyes, the absence of anything written that could protect me later, and the doubt would harden into resolve. I began by mapping reality, not the org chart version, but the actual one. I documented dependencies, informal processes, quiet exceptions that only existed because I'd made judgment calls years earlier when something was about to fail and no one else was around to care. I didn't copy proprietary data or steal anything tangible. I simply made an inventory of knowledge, and with each line I wrote, my understanding sharpened. The more I saw, the clearer it became that the system they thought they owned was in fact a patchwork of personal decisions and privately maintained tools that lived outside official documentation. That realization came with fear. If I was wrong, if they could replace me easily, then leaving would just make me unemployed and bitter. To test that, I took my first risk, small enough to be deniable. I delayed a routine optimization I usually ran silently every Wednesday, something that smoothed data reconciliation overnight. Nothing catastrophic happened, but by Thursday morning I heard murmurs. Reports were slower, a client had asked why numbers looked different than usual. I fixed it before it escalated, heart pounding harder than I expected, and told myself it was coincidence. But then I tried again. This time removing myself from a meeting I always attended just in case. The meeting ran long. Decisions were deferred. Later, a manager asked me why the usual follow-up hadn't been sent. I apologized and sent it immediately, calm on the outside, adrenaline buzzing underneath. Each test taught me two things. The machine depended on me more than anyone admitted, and I was still capable of pulling back without anyone immediately noticing why. The danger, I realized, wasn't that I would be caught sabotaging something, it was that I would be talked into staying. Martin started scheduling check-ins with me, suddenly interested in my workload, asking leading questions about what could be standardized, who else could take over certain responsibilities. Every question felt like a probe, and I answered carefully, truthfully but incompletely, offering surface explanations that sounded sufficient while protecting the deeper mechanics. The internal conflict intensified. I had always believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching, and now I was deliberately choosing opacity. Some nights I wondered if this made me the villain in my own story. Other nights I imagined agreeing to the pay cut, waiting patiently, and watching as months passed and the temporary became permanent, and that image settled the argument. The first real complication came unexpectedly from a colleague named Evan, a junior analyst who'd started shadowing me months earlier. He was sharp, curious, and, unlike management, genuinely wanted to understand how things worked. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk and asked a question that cut too close to the bone about one of the reconciliation flows. I deflected, but his confusion lingered, and later that day, Martin emailed me asking why Evan couldn't reproduce a result I'd shown him earlier in the year. It was subtle, but I felt the net tightening. I realized that if I waited too long, they would either extract what they needed from me or manufacture a reason to let me go on their terms.
That night, instead of sleeping, I drafted my resignation letter and didn't send it. Writing it made everything real in a way planning hadn't. My hands shook, not with fear of revenge, but with the weight of finality. The next morning, a small success arrived unannounced. A client I'd worked with for years called me directly, bypassing the usual channels, frustrated about a delay and asking if I could work my magic. I fixed the issue in minutes, and during the call, almost as an aside, the client said, "If you ever leave there, we'd want someone like you." I ended the call politely, sat back, and felt the tension in my chest loosen just a fraction. It wasn't an offer, not yet, but it was confirmation. I wasn't imagining my value. The plan wasn't fully formed, but for the first time, it felt viable, and that made it far more dangerous. The illusion that I still had time shattered the afternoon Martin called me into his office without a calendar invite, the door already closed when I arrived, blinds half drawn, as if the city itself were a distraction he didn't want. He spoke softly, almost kindly, telling me he'd been reviewing dependencies and that leadership wanted to accelerate knowledge transfer to reduce single points of failure. The phrase landed like a threat dressed as strategy. He slid a document across the desk outlining a cross-training plan that would siphon pieces of my work to 3 different teams, and as I scanned it, I saw how clumsy it was, how it misunderstood the interlocks I'd built, but also how dangerous it could be if followed blindly. My first instinct was to argue, to explain why this would break things, but I caught myself. Explaining had always been my reflex, and it had never protected me. Instead, I nodded and asked how soon he wanted to start. Martin smiled, relief flickering across his face, and told me immediately. Walking back to my desk, I felt the pressure ratchet up another notch. If I complied fully, I'd be dismantling my own leverage. If I resisted openly, I'd confirm his suspicion that I was a risk to be managed. That night, I stood in my kitchen staring at the resignation letter still unsent on my laptop, wrestling with a moral line I'd never imagined crossing. I didn't want to hurt the company indiscriminately. People depended on those systems, people who hadn't cut my pay or smiled while doing it. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the real harm was already baked in. Martin wasn't trying to make things resilient, he was trying to make me irrelevant before the consequences of his decision became visible. The next week became a chess match played in silence. I participated in the knowledge transfer, but selectively, sharing surface workflows while omitting the fragile exceptions that kept everything balanced. Each omission felt like a small betrayal of my former self, and the guilt gnawed at me. But it was tempered by a growing anger as I watched Martin present progress updates to executives, crediting process improvements for stability that existed only because I was still quietly intervening. Then came the first unexpected consequence. A payment batch failed overnight, not catastrophically, but enough to trigger client inquiries. I fixed it quickly, as I always had, but this time Martin CC'd the executive team on a follow-up email framing the incident as evidence of why decentralization was necessary. Reading it, I felt something inside me go cold. He was laying groundwork, shaping a narrative where failures were my fault and solutions were his. The realization hit hard. This wasn't just about money, he was insulating himself. That night, Evan messaged me, confused and stressed, saying he'd been asked to take ownership of a process he barely understood and that something didn't feel right. I stared at the message longer than I should have. Helping him fully would accelerate my own erasure. Leaving him floundering would make him collateral damage. I compromised, giving him just enough to survive the immediate issue without revealing the deeper structure. It felt awful, and for the first time I wondered if the cost of seeing this through would be losing the respect of people like him, which had always mattered more to me than titles or pay. The twist came a few days later, delivered casually over coffee by a manager I trusted. She mentioned, almost apologetically, that she'd overheard Martin talking about freeing budget for a senior hire he'd worked with before, someone who'd really get his vision. The math clicked instantly. My pay cut wasn't a temporary necessity, it was a funding mechanism.
I was being squeezed to make room for someone else, and once that person arrived, there would be no incentive to restore anything I'd lost.
The anger that followed was sharper, cleaner, and with it came clarity. I stopped thinking in terms of defense and started thinking in terms of exit. I scheduled a meeting with HR to ask, hypothetically, about ownership of tools developed outside official scope. The answer was cautious but telling. Anything built on personal equipment without company resources wasn't automatically theirs. That night, I began disentangling in earnest, migrating my personal automation tools off shared servers, documenting nothing new, letting the official knowledge base stagnate. The psychological pressure mounted daily. Martin's tone shifted from friendly to watchful. He asked pointed questions, requested access audits, hinted at compliance reviews. Each move made my pulse spike, but also confirmed that he sensed control slipping. The most dangerous moment came when he asked me to hand over admin credentials for redundancy. Saying no outright would be insubordination. Saying yes would be surrender. I told him I'd prepare a secure transfer plan and bought myself time. That evening, exhausted and wired, I received an email from the client who'd hinted at interest weeks earlier. This time it wasn't vague. They wanted to talk seriously, soon. Relief and terror collided in my chest. An exit was possible, but not yet clean. The next morning, before I could act on anything, HR sent a formal notice scheduling a performance review focused on collaboration and transparency. It was procedural language, but I knew what it meant. They were moving to put me on record as a problem. Sitting alone at my desk, surrounded by systems humming on borrowed time, I felt the weight of the entire plan balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong move now, and I'd lose everything: leverage, reputation, future. For the first time since this began, doubt surged back, heavy and suffocating. I realized that the next decision I made wouldn't just escalate the conflict, it would decide whether I walked away in control or was pushed out as a cautionary tale.
The performance review meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, which told me everything I needed to know about how it was meant to end. People who expect cooperation schedule mornings. People who expect compliance schedule Fridays. By then, my plan was no longer theoretical, but it was still fragile, dependent on timing and on my ability to keep my composure while the walls closed in. I spent that week moving carefully, completing only what was explicitly assigned, refusing to patch gaps I'd normally cover instinctively. The office felt different when I did that. Noisier, rougher, like a machine running without oil. I watched managers argue over reports that no longer lined up perfectly, watched Evan grow more stressed as responsibilities were dumped on him without context, watched Martin pace more during meetings, his confidence beginning to crack at the edges. On Wednesday evening, I met the client in a quiet restaurant near the waterfront, neutral territory. They didn't waste time. They wanted me to come on as an independent consultant immediately, with a longer-term role to be discussed later. The work would start the moment I was available. I asked for 48 hours. Walking back to my car, rain slicking the pavement, I felt something close to grief for the career I was about to end, even as release loosened a knot I hadn't realized was permanent. Thursday morning brought the first real shockwave. A system I'd warned about years earlier but never been authorized to rebuild finally buckled under load. Not a total failure, but enough to delay transactions across multiple clients. The fix required a workaround I'd designed privately, one I hadn't documented because it lived outside official scope. Martin's team scrambled, messages flew, my phone buzzed incessantly. I sat there, heart pounding, knowing that if I stepped in now, everything would stabilize and the narrative would reset.
If I didn't, the consequences would be immediate and visible. This was the moment I'd been circling without naming. The moral dilemma crystallized into a single, brutal choice: intervene and preserve a company that had already decided to discard me, or let the failure expose the truth they'd been hiding behind my silence. I waited. For an hour, then 2. Eventually, Martin appeared at my desk, voice tight, asking if I could take a look. I told him I'd be happy to,
after my review meeting, as my current priorities had been reassigned. The look he gave me then wasn't anger, it was fear. The review itself was exactly what I expected, a choreography of concern about my resistance to change and communication gaps, carefully documented. I listened, answered calmly, and when it was my turn, I did something unexpected. I handed in my resignation letter, effective immediately, and slid across a separate document outlining my availability as an external consultant at a rate triple my reduced salary. The room went silent. HR blinked. Martin's face flushed, then drained. He tried to regain control, talking about notice periods and obligations, but I had anticipated that too. I explained, politely, that I was in compliance, that anything built on my own equipment would be removed by end of day, and that I wished them well. I stood up before anyone could respond and walked out feeling lighter with every step, even as adrenaline made my hands shake. Within minutes, the calls started. Missed calls at first, then emails marked urgent. By the time I reached the elevator, the system issue had escalated into a full-blown incident, clients demanding answers, executives demanding solutions. I went home and began disconnecting, shutting down my personal tools, revoking my own access cleanly, methodically, the way I did everything. An hour later, Martin called again, this time without pretense, asking me to come back just for the weekend, promising we could revisit the compensation issue. I told him my terms were in the document and ended the call. The unexpected twist came that evening when Evan showed up at my door, eyes red, apologizing for not understanding sooner. He told me Martin had blamed the outage on poor documentation and hinted that I'd been negligent. Hearing that snapped something final into place. I forwarded Evan the bare minimum he needed to keep himself safe and told him to look after his own career first. Late that night, my phone buzzed with a message from the client confirming they were ready to proceed the next morning. I sat in the dark, listening to the city, aware that the next day would determine everything: my reputation, Martin's narrative, the company's future. Somewhere between exhaustion and resolve, I realized the plan was no longer about revenge as emotion. It was about letting consequences unfold without shielding anyone from them. As dawn approached, emails from my former company piled up unanswered, each more desperate than the last, and I knew that when the sun rose, there would be no way for them to contain what was coming. By mid-morning, the situation I'd stepped away from had become public within the industry, not because I said a word, but because failure at that scale never stays quiet.
Clients talk, vendors talk, people who were suddenly missing money talk loudest of all. I was already seated in a borrowed conference room at the client's office when my former company's name appeared in a trade Slack channel I followed out of habit, attached to speculation about delayed settlements and internal restructuring. I felt an unexpected pang then, not guilt exactly, but recognition. This was the sound of a reputation cracking, something I'd once worked tirelessly to protect. My phone vibrated non-stop until I turned it face down. When I did check it later, there were messages not just from Martin, but from executives who'd never learned my last name until that week, suddenly eager to reset the conversation. One email stood out, carefully worded, apologizing for missteps in leadership communication and offering to restore my pay retroactively if I returned immediately. It was almost convincing, and that was the most unsettling part. I realized how close I'd come to believing this was all an accident rather than a choice. I replied once, professionally, declining and reiterating my consulting terms. They never accepted them. Instead, over the next 48 hours, the truth emerged the way it always does, through documents and timing rather than confessions. An internal audit, triggered by the outage, uncovered the rushed budget reallocations Martin had pushed through, the promised hire whose offer letter predated my pay cut, the warnings I'd logged years earlier that had been deprioritized under his efficiency initiative. Martin was placed on leave, then quietly removed. No announcement, no apology, just his name disappearing from calendars and email threads.
Evan messaged me later to say he'd been reassigned and was looking elsewhere, wiser now, less trusting. I didn't feel triumph at that news, only a tired acceptance that some lessons cost more than others. As for me, the client engagement turned into months of work, then into something stable and different. I was no longer invisible, no longer maintaining systems in silence while others took credit for their survival. Yet the satisfaction I'd imagined felt muted. Revenge, I learned, isn't a sharp explosion. It's a slow release of pressure, leaving behind an emptiness where adrenaline used to live. Some nights I still thought about the office by the water, about mornings when the fog lifted and everything worked because I made it work. I wondered if I could have left sooner, cleaner, without forcing failure to prove a point. But then I remembered the meeting, the smile, the word temporary floating without anchors, and I knew I hadn't created the outcome so much as stopped preventing it. The final closure came unexpectedly weeks later when a former executive reached out privately to say, "We should have listened." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was acknowledgement, and that mattered more than I expected. Sitting at my new desk, sunlight unfiltered, systems humming that I was paid openly to understand, I felt something settle inside me. Loyalty, I realized, isn't a virtue on its own, it's a contract, and contracts require mutual respect. When one side decides you're expendable, the most honest response isn't to burn everything down, nor to quietly endure, but to step away and let reality speak in your absence. I didn't win because they lost. I won because I finally chose myself, and that was the only outcome that could have lasted.